Welcome back. This presentation is a review from your last class on qualitative rigor. So the PowerPoint that I got this information from is in Learning Activity 11 up on Blackboard. So if you remember, I just want you to have it on tape as well. Let me just go in here and make my slide bigger. If you remember, of course, you do remember that the qualitative paradigm, reams and reams and reams of data are generated because it's often transcripts of interviews. When you're evaluating the quality of a qualitative article or study, you need to think about how well the authors adhered to the overall design, depending on what design they've chosen. And we'll come back to some of the challenges with that in a minute. But in terms of data collection and analysis, does the article look typical for that design? Do they explain their concepts in detail, either at the beginning in the background section or afterward in the discussion section? And do they tie it to literature? Is there clear evidence of the method and/or the philosophy underlining the study? So an example would be, if it's a phenomenology study, do they clearly describe some of the main tenets of phenomenology, such as bracketing? Do they mention that it's hermeneutical or some other mention of the philosophy underlining the study? A grounded theory, for example, is there clear evidence of Glaser and Strauss and symbolic interactionism underpinning the study? If these terms are not making sense to you, go back and look at the video about qualitative designs. You need to ask yourself when you're evaluating quality, who did the study? Remember the credentials of the authors and who actually what their background is important. Is the study, again, typical of the stated design? Are the concepts explained before the study aim? Ideally they are. And is there enough context in the sample description? Whoops, this thing's on autopilot here. Overall quality, is there information about the approach used beyond the design, particularly in designs that you don't know well, that seem to be a bit novel? Do they give you a little bit of a background of that design, assuming that many readers would not understand that design? It's okay if you don't completely understand the information about the approach, but you should see the type of details that would make you think, oh, I see, that's probably a grounded theory, or that's probably a phenomenology study. Again, in the exam, you'll have time to dig back into the textbook to make a judgment call on some of this. So it's okay if you don't memorize those names. Lesser quality articles, we talked a lot of those, and a lot of you in your reviews found yourself with these lesser quality articles. Maybe they're not even lesser quality. They're just articles that do not adhere to a specific overt design choice that we know of, that we talked about in class. They call that qualitative without adherence to a specific tradition or something like that. I call it qualitative light, as you know. There's either a mixture of traditions or just what they call a general qualitative process, and they talk about collecting interview data and analyzing it for emergent themes. But they don't really go into a lot of detail about how they analyze it, at least not consistent with methods that we've learned about in class. Now, the three criteria, beyond what I just mentioned, the three main criteria for quality across all qualitative articles is this idea of credibility, auditability, and fittingness, also known as transferability. And there's a tiny little snippet about this in your textbook in the chapter on rigor. Credibility comes back to this idea of, is it true? But by the word true, I don't mean, accurate information from the participants so much as did they accurately capture what the participants said? So, and do they interpret in a logical way? So does it ring true to someone, if someone who was actually in the interviews, if participants read the study, would it ring true to them? I'll come back to member checks, but that would be going back to the participants to validate what they said. If other people living the experience were to read the study, would it ring true to them? And if so, now that's something you can only really imagine unless you actually put some patients in a room and have them read the study. But if you can imagine that it seems to ring true, that's credibility. And people who work in the field can evaluate credibility as well. And sometimes the article will mention going back to people with experience in the field to validate the data, for lack of a better word, enhance the credibility. So you should look for things like member checking, returning to the participants, or something about going back to the participants, not just for a second interview because you want 2 interviews, but to actually clarify and give them an opportunity to clarify or change responses. You should see evidence of prolonged engagement, that they do spend significant time with the participants, either in interviews or in observations or something like that. Peer debriefing is going again to the experts in the field or people who work in that world. You should also see, or you may also see, evidence of what they call triangulation of data. Now that can be the data is triangulated, i.e. some of it's quantitative, some of it's qualitative, some of it's interviews, some of it's observations, some of it's field notes, some of it's writings. That would be triangulation of data. You can have triangulation of settings where people are interviewed in more than one setting. Say, for example, a qualitative study where some of the participants are in hospital, some are at home, some are in long-term care. And you can have triangulation of discipline. An example being a sociologist, a nurse, and a physiotherapist analyzing the data. You may also see them talk about a search for disconfirming evidence to look for that person for which these statements are not true or do not reflect their reality. And they're kind of looking for that odd man out. They may mention that. And it won't be written up in the article, but you can examine the researcher credibility, their experience, their credentials, their past publications. And since for my exam you'll have time to do that, it's not a bad idea. You should always be concerned if you read that a single researcher is responsible for all collection, analysis, and interpretation of data. It's not commonly seen in this paradigm. The exception being if somebody is a very large guru in the world. And the example I always give you is Sally Thorne. She has her own interpretive descriptive method, and sometimes she does write alone. But even with that, she does have other people involved in the data collection and interpretation. Again, credibility is prolonged engagement, discussion about the length of interviews or observations, and the length of the study overall. Member checking, coming back to participants, asking them to confirm or refute the findings. Disconfirming evidence, the person out in left field. You achieve this through purposive sampling. You go back to people who can help you and you try to make sure you've captured as many perspectives as possible. And you keep revising the theory. Triangulation, as I mentioned before, be alert to that. The statements such as the team was a mix of disciplines, 3 researchers read and reread the transcripts. Informants' reports were also supported by discussion with public health nurses. Quality and the credibility, again, quality can be also auditability. So when you think of auditability, think about a trail, right? My Grand Canyon trail picture here. So a trail. Auditability relates to how objective they were. Now, I know I've told you in the qualitative world subjectivity is important. We are seeking their subjective experiences, but we have to be objective in our process. There should be enough written in the article that you can see how they went from the research purpose to the research question through the steps of analysis, and you can follow their reasoning, whether you agree or disagree with their findings. If there's any mention of how they handle bias, which you may see, for example, in phenomenology, something about bracketing. If they have what they call a decision trail outlined for you. If they've included significant raw data, direct quotes that support their analysis. Again, I talked about bracketing for phenomenology. If they have any discussion of how they kept and kept track of their field notes, or a reflexive journal, all of these things could be methods to enhance auditability. Transferability or fittingness is not a synonym for generalizability, which is the quantitative goal, right? But it's the degree to which their findings can be applied outside of their study, and how faithful they were to the everyday reality of the participants. So to some degree, this is your evaluation of how important it would be to your own practice or research. Now, obviously, as beginner people, you don't have these things, but I often ask you a question related to the implications for you clinically. That's a separate question, and you can really talk in much more general statements if something might or might not be useful to you. But this is the idea of, if I worked in that field, would I find this information useful? Would it change something about the way I see my patients? Or might I even give this study some of these results, or mention some of these results to patients in order to help them? And if the answer is yes, information from this study would be useful for me, then it has transferability or fittingness. Things like thick descriptions of the sample and the design and the process helps you, the idea that there's enough details about the setting that you can say, this probably would be similar here. So I'll give you an example. Say you had a study and it was about long-term care, and it was in the UK or Switzerland or something, and it was about something about supporting people in end-of-life decision-making. There needs to be enough of a description of what the long-term care setting looks like there, what the supports are, who's there, who's looking after people, so that you could see, yes, this process might be useful to me in Canada in a long-term care facility. They're not going to directly state that, but if they have enough details that you can visualize or see the setting, then the transferability would be high. Remember, data quality is linked to analysis, so you need to look past the methods section, get into the discussion section and the results section. Highly credible data ties well to other research, so you'll see lots of examples of discussing their findings and tying it to other studies. And they often talk about data quality and rigor in their discussion section, so don't skip that section. And don't skip the research implications section. The article may or may not overtly state data rigor. Some qualitative articles do have little snippets. Others you need to look for it yourself. Remember, these three criteria are some of the they are the most important probably criteria: credibility, auditability, and fittingness for judging quality of the qualitative research, and thus very important that you spend more time reviewing this content. There's not much in the book. I did give you a separate handout, and it's important to look at that little handout in your content folder as well. And look up anything you don't understand. Hope this helps. Take care.